Okay, and I think we're live. Hi everyone, how are you guys feeling for the APUSH exam tomorrow? We're really excited for you, and we are lending all our emotional support and our historical support today. On a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being good, 1 being like over it, can't even. How do you guys feel? Dying, bad, not as bad, feeling okay. It's okay, guys. It's okay. At this point, it's just an exam, and we're gonna be going over like the basics and helping you guys with all your questions. We're gonna do like a whole Q&A. It'll be good. And you know, just just try to like absorb everything you can today, and then you guys could go to sleep tonight and be good. Yeah, I panicked too during the exams, but it's okay. You got this. So I think Zoe, you're pulling up the slide, right?
Zoe just texted that she got kicked out.
Oh, okay. Okay. I'll try pulling up the slides then, but like, let me see if it works.
Technical difficulties.
Okay. So, what do you guys expect out of today's finale? Just like a reassurance, or like to get over, fix some questions, or what? Screen slides. Share my. Okay. Okay. So, could you guys see the slides? Okay. So you could see. Okay. So today is the last night of your Fileable Cram. So it's the finale. So again, remember to follow at Think Fileable on social, and we have crams for so many other APs if you guys are taking multiple. And then it's the final countdown. So we wish you the best of luck. And this is our agenda for today. And just a gentle reminder, if you have any questions during review, which I'm sure you will because it's the day before, please ask in the chat. We'll be here to support you emotionally and with reasoning. So, how to make the most out of a cram finale. So, remember to take notes, maybe take it on a paper, take it on a Google Doc, whatever you feel more comfortable with. The Cram Hub has old slides, so the review packet and the replays and everything, they're all for you. And then the group chat, share your tips and tricks and participate when we ask questions. And the Q&A tab is for asking any question. Please check the comments for the answers. And also remember to be respectful in the chat. And also in the Cram Hub, you will see the Google Slides. And at the end of the Google Slides, there's like a bunch of slides with the timeline for all the APUSH events, because a lot of you guys were asking that in these past few days. And then, yeah, we will take breaks, and then the replay will be available after the event, but I highly recommend going to sleep. So again, be supportive, be patient, be kind, and let's do this. And then, okay, and remember, you could win 100 by sharing your Cram experience and posting about your Cram finale experience on TikTok or Instagram by using hashtag FileableCrams and tagging Fileable and making us laugh out loud, or getting a ton of views. And several students will win $100 each week and will be notified through the Cram Instagram or TikTok account. So, 1 Supreme Court cases. So, Emmy.
Okay, so I can't see Helen's slide show, but I'm gonna assume what slides that we're on. Like I'm gonna like read her mind telepathically.
I could just announce the titles of the slides if you want.
No, I'll just read your mind. I got it. Okay. So I'm assuming we're on Marbury v. Madison. This is like the first important case that you need to know for APUSH. The main idea that you really need to know is that from this court, the Supreme Court established the principle of judicial review, which is pretty much in the name. It just gives the court the power to declare a law or government action unconstitutional. So it's literally reviewing like what other people judge, I guess. So it's in the name. You guys should definitely be familiar with this. But if you're not, we'll go over it today. What? Oh, wait, can you go back to Marbury v. Madison? Okay, great. Um, so you don't really need to know the backstory behind a lot of these cases, but I'm just going to give them to you because they might help you with some of the multiple choice or for an LEQ or a DBQ. But pretty much after Thomas Jefferson defeated John Adams in the 1800 presidential election, um, John Adams was pretty salty, so he passed the Judiciary Act of 1801, which created new courts, added judges, and gave the president more control over appointment of judges. And so this act pretty much allowed him to put a bunch of new judges in and sort of like control the federal government while he wasn't in office. So obviously Jefferson was like not having it. He was like, no way, Jose. So he doesn't deliver a bunch of the commissions for the judges so that they aren't really validly appointed. So then one of the judges, William Marbury, gets like super like angry and he sues Madison. He sues him for his commission and he sues him under the writ of mandamus, which is pretty much like an order from a court of any government to do some specific act that the government is obligated under law to do. So you don't really need to understand the writ of mandamus, just sort of know that Marbury tried to use that to get his commission. And then in conclusion, the court found that Madison's refusal to deliver the commission was illegal, but they did not actually order Madison to hand over the commission because they thought that the commission was actually unconstitutional in itself. I mean, it thought also that the Judiciary Act of 1789 was unconstitutional, just because it extends beyond the court's original jurisdiction, and so it's not within their powers. So because they were reviewing that law and they declared it unconstitutional, that's how judicial review was sort of established. Okay, and then next we're going to go on to McCulloch versus Maryland. This is the second court case that you need to know. I sort of get the like M cases confused, you know, like Marbury, Madison, McCulloch, Maryland. So I would pay specific attention to these. But pretty much McCulloch versus Maryland is when in 1816 Congress chartered the second bank of the United States. And in 1818, the state of Maryland passed legislation to tax that bank. And so James W. McCulloch, who was the cashier of the Baltimore branch of the bank, refused to pay the tax. And the state appeals court held that the second bank was unconstitutional because the Constitution did not provide a textual commitment for the federal government to charter a bank. So pretty much this causes two issues to arise. Did the Congress have the implied power to create a bank? And secondly, could states tax a federal entity and bank? So in the unanimous decision, it pretty much comes to like two decisions. First, that the court held that the Congress had the power to incorporate the bank, and it also held that Maryland could not tax federal or national government institutions. So this is important because Congress uses the necessary and proper clause to sort of jump to the conclusion that Congress is not limited by its express powers and that it actually has implied powers. So this means that they can use powers that are sort of built upon the powers specifically listed in the Constitution, and it's sort of in the name, like they are implied. So it's a little vague, but they can sort of build off of those powers and do other things. Like they can borrow money, they can coin money, and they can tax people. And in this case, it would also mean building a bank. It also concluded, based on the supremacy clause, that national laws were superior to state laws. So therefore, the state could not tax the federal bank. So that's also sort of it's in the name, like supremacy clause, think like the national law is supreme, you know? Also, I just want to say, I don't know if you guys can hear me. my chat isn't loading, so
We could hear you, don't worry.
okay. Okay, I guess Helen can I can see Helen, so that's good. Does anyone need me to go over any of the slides again? I know I tend to talk a little fast. Or should we move on to the next slides?
I
Okay.
think people
Let's move on to. Hello?
No, it's okay. I was just saying move on to the next slide.
Okay. Sorry. Crowdcast. What a nightmare. Anyways, so like I said before, you don't really need to know like the lore behind all of these cases. In the case of Gibbons versus Ogden, is that how you say it? Pretty much there's like a bunch of beef between these two steamship companies, right? Gibbons is concerned about like the competing claims of rival steamship franchises. In the state of New York gave Ogden like an exclusive license to operate his boats between New Jersey and New York City on the Hudson River. And then Gibbons was like, hey, that's not fair. Like, I want to drive my boats too. And so pretty much Gibbons sues over it. He's like, you don't have the right to this, the Hudson River, right? That doesn't make sense because the federal government is in charge of interstate commerce, not the like state of New York. So pretty much the court uses the Commerce Clause to sort of give Congress authority over interstate navigation. And so this case is important. You need to know that that Justice Marshall concluded that regulation of navigation by steamboat operators for other purposes of conducting like interstate commerce was a power reserved to and exercised by the Congress under the Commerce Clause. So it just this decision established the principle of federal supremacy, just sort of like the other case, and also that the federal government has the power to regulate interstate commerce. So moving on to the Dred Scott v. Sandford case. Dred Scott was an enslaved person in Missouri, and from 1833 to 1843, he lived in Illinois, which was a free state, and in the Louisiana Territory, where slavery was forbidden from the Missouri Compromise of 1820. But after he returns to Missouri, he pretty much sues the Missouri court for his freedom, claiming that since he lived in like the free territory for a little bit, he was a free man. But he actually loses in the court, so he brings it to the Supreme Court. And in that case, Scott's master pretty much argued that no slave or a descendant of a slave could be a citizen, so they couldn't sue. So in the majority opinion, they held that a Black slave whose ancestors were imported to the US and sold as slaves, whether enslaved or free, could not be an American citizen and therefore did not have the right to sue in federal court. And so because of this, they just dismissed the case based on like procedural grounds. Because if you're not a citizen, you can't sue, right? Sue in the Supreme Court. So they also further built upon that decision, and they held that the Missouri Compromise of 1820 was actually unconstitutional and foreclosed Congress from freeing slaves within federal territories. This was really important because it pretty much declared like all enslaved people as property under the Fifth Amendment, and they pretty much were like, oh, well, depriving people of their property is unconstitutional. This is an extremely controversial court case, and it is later overturned, but it's important to know, especially if you get an LEQ or a DBQ from this time period. And then moving on to the Plessy v. Ferguson, which is an also extremely controversial court case, who's sort of like also on the wrong side of history. This court case sort of starts when Louisiana enacts a separate car act, which pretty much requires separate railway cars for Black people and white people. And Homer Plessy, who is 7/8 Caucasian, but because of that 1/8, he is technically Black under Louisiana law. He sat in a whites-only car of a Louisiana train. And when he was told to vacate, he refused and he was arrested. And so at the time, his lawyers argued that the Separate Car Act violated the 13th and 14th Amendments. The 13th abolished slavery, and the 14th said that everyone born in the US is a citizen and provided with equal protection under law. But the judge found that Louisiana could enforce this law as it enforced affected railroads within its boundaries. So Plessy was still convicted. And so when this court eventually made its way to the Supreme Court, when this case eventually made its way to the Supreme Court, they pretty much questioned, does the Separate Car Act violate the 14th Amendment? And in the end, the court upheld that it actually didn't violate any of the Constitution. And it pretty much concluded that as long as things were separate but equal, it isn't unconstitutional at all. And because of this, a lot of African Americans in America were given different treatment in different facilities, such as restaurants, bathrooms, and even basic amenities, such as a water fountain. And so, in short, this case pretty much declared that segregation in itself did not constitute unlawful discrimination. And now I'll pass this slide off to Zoe for Schenck versus the United States.
Zoe, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, my laptop is muted. My bad. So, hi. So Schenck versus United States is one of those you're probably going to see around World War I. And it definitely has to do with the idea of the increasing fears around public perception of war and the idea of how impactful people's printed word and spoken word can have on America. So Charles Schenck was charged under the Espionage Act for mailing printed circulars or pamphlets against World War I and the military draft. He claimed and he argued that the draft was violating the 13th Amendment because the draft was another version of slavery. So this idea is a lot of, so he basically said that the draft is like slavery. And the Espionage Act allows for any citizen to be fined or imprisoned for speaking out against the government or the war effort. Schenck is just his last name. Oh, I realized what you just said. It's funny. So Espionage Act, wow, like an odd word, basically allows for any citizen to be fined or imprisoned for speaking out against the government or the war effort. Schenck sued, saying that his First Amendment rights are being suspended and that the Espionage Act is unconstitutional, but the Supreme Court found that during war times, if a person's speech presents a clear and present danger, their First Amendment rights can be suspended. So this is the idea, if you want to have an example, of how during wartime, the federal government's powers are increased, and in this case, the federal government's powers to infringe upon individual liberties are increased, therefore limiting Schenck's ability to speak out against the government and their draft.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about Korematsu versus US. This happens about 20 years later, and this is during World War II, and this is in response to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. After this attack, the US government decided to require Japanese Americans to move into relocation camps, otherwise known as internment camps, as a matter of national security. And so in February of 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. And this was about 2 months after Pearl Harbor. And during this time, a Japanese American man living in San Leonardo, Fred Korematsu, chose to stay in his residence rather than obey the order to relocate. And because of this, he was arrested and convicted of violating the order. And he responded by arguing that the executive order of 9066 violated the Fifth Amendment. Roosevelt justified the orders on the grounds of military necessity. Pretty much, he declared that Japanese Americans were a threat to national security. And this increased a lot of anti-Japanese sentiments around the nation and a lot of racism towards Japanese people and Asian people in general. And so when this court case eventually makes its way to the Supreme Court, the justices pretty much question, like, did the president and Congress go beyond their war powers by implementing exclusion and restricting the rights of Americans of Japanese descent? And in their evaluation, they pretty much ruled that the evacuation order violated by Korematsu was valid. So that means that, like, the executive order did not show racial prejudice, but was rather responding to a strategic imperative of keeping the US and particularly the West Coast secure from invasion. That was their opinion, at least. Like, historically, it's obviously a very a race and obviously a very controversial take. In addition to its historical significance, the case had a great legal impact because it was the first time the court ever created like a separate standard of review for a law utilizing a suspect classification, such as like discriminating on race. Now I'm going to pass the slides over to Zoe, and she's going to talk about Brown versus the Board of Education.
Okay, so I'm back. We have Brown versus Board of Education. So Emmy just did a great job at explaining Plessy versus Ferguson. Remember, separate but equal. And this once again legalized segregation in all public places, including public schools. So once again, you'd have schools that, yes, they were quote unquote equal because there were black schools and white schools. So therefore everyone was getting the same facilities, but they were separate. Now the quality of those facilities are debatable, making them not necessarily equal. So in the 1950s, a lot of black families were really looking for higher education for their children. Black schools were not as funded as much. Yes, the Little Rock Nine did come from this. They were not as supported as white schools. So the Brown family tried to put their daughter into a white school and was denied. So the Browns, with 12 other local families, filed a class action lawsuit against the Topeka Board of Education, which argued that racial segregation in public schools violated the 14th Amendment. 14th Amendment, remember, is about citizenship, is that equality through the Equal Protection Clause, all citizens have to be treated equally in the eyes of the law. These are public institutions, therefore, the Browns are arguing that this is not equal in the eyes of the law. So this does bring a rise to Little Rock Nine, and the Supreme Court found that there was a landmark decision that established that racial segregation in public schools is unconstitutional, and you're going to get Ruby Bridges, the Little Rock Nine, and other important people that stood up and decided to break the education barriers. Okay, Gideon v. Wainwright. This is one of those like very odd ones. It's definitely seen more like APUSH, but Gideon was a Florida man who did not have money for representative counsel. He was poor. He could not afford a lawyer. That's what it really means. But Florida, Ruby Bridges was much like Little Rock Nine. She's one of the first little girls to go to an all-white school. She was black. And when she went to the schools, all of the white parents removed their children from the school, and she was taught alone by a white teacher. And eventually the parents had to realize that their kids can't miss out on their education because they're racist. So, yeah, this is another Florida man arrested, but Florida only supplied lawyers for capital crimes, and Gideon didn't fit the requirements. So Gideon was not going to be given a lawyer in court, and he sued. And because the Sixth Amendment guarantees the right to counsel, the Supreme Court found that the policies of Florida to be unconstitutional, and you can't only say if you commit a capital crime, you get a lawyer. Everybody needs to be given a lawyer, whether it's in civil or criminal court. So, I think you're right, Helen. He looks like Goofy. Olivia, he wasn't going to get a lawyer because he was poor. Florida only had a rule that they would only give free lawyers. Now in every state you get a free lawyer regardless of you being rich or not, or if you can afford it. But here, here anyone would get it. Only people who committed like serious crimes would get it if you couldn't afford it. Now everyone can. This crime, it's one's like nitty gritty details you don't need to know. You're good, Helen. So Miranda v. Arizona, someone just asked about this in the chat. So if you've ever watched Law and Order or any single police or lawyer show, they're going to say that yes, selective incorporation was implied. Do that. But once again, Miranda v. Arizona is the Miranda rights, the idea that you have the right to remain silent. If you can't afford an attorney, one will be presented to you. All of that are considered Miranda rights because of the court case. So Miranda was arrested at his home and taken into custody to a police station, but never made aware of his rights. He argued that he was not made aware of his rights of free speech, or not speaking, the fact that he would be presented a lawyer, and not a lot of people know this on the top of their minds. So he sued, and this established a code of conduct for police interrogations of criminal suspects held in custody. Now, when either arresting or interrogating a suspect, you have to make their rights very clear. Like this one's kind of more well known. Yes, this is where the whole pleading the fifth. Now you're being told that you can plead the fifth because not everybody knows that. Next slide. So Roe v. Wade, I feel like this is another one everyone knows, especially now, because yeah, for real, RIP over Roe v. Wade. But it's kind of important to know the details of this one. It might show up on a test. I feel like a lot of people do, but it's good to review. So in 1970, a woman who's not really named Jane Roe, it's just like an alias that they use because it was controversial at the time, filed a lawsuit. It is an APUSH. It's not been removed. Only in AP Gov it's been removed. But you guys might see it on your exam, so we're going to review it. Jane Roe filed a lawsuit to challenge a Texas law making abortion illegal except by a doctor's orders to save a woman's life. She argued that it was a woman's right, I believe, through the First, Fourth, Ninth, and 14th Amendments, but the Supreme Court found that a woman's right to abortion fell well within the right to privacy protected by the 4th and 14th Amendments. So you should really you see this, think right to privacy, abortions. Once again, this is something that I feel like everybody, once again, we should keep it nice in the chat, and we don't need to share our personal opinions, but this is basically about the right to privacy given by the 4th Amendment and then applied to states of the 14th. Once again, don't really know the nitty-gritty, but that's it. Yes, it did, Ryan. Next. So this one we kind of like touched a little bit upon yesterday, and I feel like everyone was very asking about Watergate, so we're going to go over it one last time. That's the monkey scopes trial. Here we have Watergate. So if you're unfamiliar with Watergate, in a very small, condensed little sentence, it is a break-in at the Democratic National Committee offices in the Watergate complex, hence the name, and Nixon knew about it. He kind of orchestrated it. This goes against, a lot of privacy laws within elections and such, because Nixon was a Republican, but it was a break-in. Disclosure of the White House involvement in the break-in and the cover-up forced President Nixon to eventually resign in 1974 to avoid impeachment. He avoided impeachment. He was going to be impeached because of this Supreme Court case. This found that Nixon claimed that he had executive privilege. He did not need to release the tapes that exposed Watergate because he was the president. He had certain privileges. The Supreme Court says that executive privileges only extends to issues of national security, not personal effects. So his own tapes that are going to expose him, are not a part of executive privilege. Therefore, he has to turn it over to the court. So that is why he resigned. It is the only president to resign to avoid impeachment. I think it's our last one. I know. So Q&A. So anybody have any questions? Only hit Snapchat.
We're also going to use this time as our break. So if you guys want to get some water, eat some food.
Just come back in maybe like 2 minutes for the rest of the amendments that I'll be going over. And also you guys can stay and ask some questions too. And actually, Emmy, I think there was a good question for you. So we'll go over that in a minute.
Yeah.
Wait, where's the question?
There's one question about Gibbons for you I just saw, and then some people want me to review.
I thought
should I go over Gibbons again?
Go over the one on the screen, and then we can do Gibbons and then Nixon.
The Missouri Compromise pretty much established the 30-60 line, and pretty much anything above the line, enslaved people would be free, and then anything under the line could continue to be slave states. And pretty much with Dred Scott's case, they pretty much ruled that enslaved people would count as property, and it would be unconstitutional to take away your property, right? That's one of your amendment. That's one of your inalienable rights. So they pretty much deemed that taking away your property, it's a extremely controversial euphemism, but they pretty much declared that to be unconstitutional. So they sort of carried that on to the Missouri Compromise and said that taking away enslaved people from slave owners is unconstitutional. Some logic, right?
I saw one on Korematsu and Gibbons.
I can go over the basics of Gibbons again. Pretty much there's two steamship companies. They're having beef, right? One's I own this river, I get to sail on this river. The New York State said that I could do it, and the other person is no, I want to sail on this river. You don't control the river, right? The federal government does. And so in the end, they rule that the federal government does have supremacy over interstate commerce, which is pretty much business that happens between states. And so they rule in favor of Gibbons. So they say that the state doesn't control the Hudson River.
Can I just jump in real quick?
Yeah.
Just the Supreme Court cases are really important to American history and to the way our government functions. But for the purpose of the exam, you don't need to memorize any of the cases. If you want to use them in your writing, in your LEQs and DBQs, it's good to know some of the context. But for multiple choice or short answer, just kind of knowing the key takeaway is going to be enough. And even in multiple choice, they're going to give you the key takeaway. You're not going to have a question that says, what was the decision in Gibbons versus Ogden? But rather, you might have Gibbons versus Ogden as an answer choice, and it'll say in Gibbons versus Ogden, comma, where they increase federal power. So it's really about understanding how the case is, what was the result of the case, the impact. So I see a lot of questions about Brown versus Board of Ed. Separate is inherently unequal, right? Leading to integration. That's a really good key takeaway. For Marbury versus Madison, you do not need to know all the details of it. Complicated. Just know that it established judicial review. It was the first case, and the Supreme Court was this is how we're going to do it. Are there any other ones that you guys want to know what that key takeaway is? Emmy and Zoe did a great job going through them, and they also are living in the slides if you want to go back. Yeah, the ones College Board, I would say Plessy versus Ferguson and Brown v. Board of Ed. Those come up a lot because they're really important to African American civil rights. I've seen like Schenck versus United States. I've seen a multiple choice set on it. Dred Scott versus Sandford key takeaway is that slaves are property and that the Constitution is going to protect property. The only issue with Dred Scott is it came out in 1857 and the Civil War began in 1860, so it didn't have an impact rather besides like pissing off the North. Roe v. Wade is women's right to privacy. Marbury versus Madison is judicial review. Mueller versus Oregon, no, I've never seen that. We are going to go over the presidents. I'm going to get you guys through that later. Did I miss any in the chat that Miranda versus Arizona, Miranda rights? Sounds easy. Worcester versus Georgia. That's another one that's kind of complicated, but it dealt with the right. It really was, and this is for all of the cases under the Marshall Court. So when John Marshall was Supreme Court Justice for 30 years, the whole from like 1800 to 1830s. And in almost every case, he said that the power of the federal government is supreme over the states. And so he was defining the power of the federal government. So Worcester versus Georgia was the issue of, can Georgia, the state, tell the Cherokee natives what to do? And the answer is no, they can't, because they're a sovereign nation and they can only negotiate and deal with the federal government. So it was a kind of blow to states' rights, which is why Andrew Jackson had a problem with it. Schenck, yes, limited rights. During wartime, you can't say whatever you want, whenever you want. The opposite, Brown versus Board of Ed overturned Plessy. All right, guys, let's talk about the amendments. And if you guys have more questions about Supreme Court cases, I'm happy to answer them in the chat.
Okay, so I'll be going on amendments. So as Zoe pulls that up, you guys could ask your final questions about, well, not your final, but some more. So for the amendments to know, you don't need to know every single amendment on the Constitution for APUSH, and I'll tell you guys which ones are the direct ones that were stated in the course exam description. Okay, so the first 10 amendments on the next slide are directly from the Bill of Rights. So you could go to the next one. Okay, so is it focus? Is there? Okay, it's bothering me. Oh, okay, I was just moving our faces and everything. Okay, so the first 10 amendments are the Bill of Rights. And so I don't want to say you necessarily need to memorize old Bill of Rights. It'll be helpful, but I don't think if you don't know them by now, it's probably a little hard to memorize it by tomorrow morning. But the Bill of Rights consists of the first 10 constitutional amendments, and they guarantee certain rights to American citizens in all circumstances. So this bill is really important because it was put forth by the Anti-Federalists, and they really pushed for this during the Constitutional Convention. They would have not ratified the Constitution without the Bill of Rights, and this was a really important debate that you do need to know about. That's why they ratified the Constitution, and they did this reluctantly. And it was put forth by anti-feds because they feared all forms of like government intrusions on personal liberties, because they were really traumatized, after the revolution and after England all in America's business. So while you don't need to memorize them, again, it's a good idea to just keep them in mind and remember that this is the only reason the anti-feds agreed to ratify the Constitution. And these rights are really essential because they shaped the United States today, and it's good to know your Bill of Rights, guys. So yeah, AP Gov is really great for this. And yeah, the Federalist Papers were created to defend the new Constitution and help ratify them. They were made by John Jay and Alexander Hamilton. And you guys don't need to know that, but it's good. Just know. So, okay. So next, we have the 12th Amendment. I'll be going straight to that. So we could go on to the next slide. So the 12th Amendment, it established a procedure for electing the President of the United States and the Vice President. So generally, it just modified the Electoral College to be more accommodating in off-party politics in presidential elections, which has gone on to be one of the most defining characteristics of American politics and the voting process. So the original article section of the Constitution required electors in states to cast 2 separate ballots, one for president and one for vice president. And it was basically up to the political parties to coordinate among their electors to make sure that their vice president candidates had at least one presidential candidate and one fewer electoral vote than presidential candidates. However, there was a communication breakdown during the infamous election of 1800. So within Jefferson's party. So when someone forgot to not vote for Jefferson's running mate, Aaron Burr, this was chaotic. And then after the electoral votes were counted, Jefferson and Burr each had 73 votes and were tied as winner. But Jefferson won most of the popular vote, and the article sent the tie election to the House, which was controlled by Adams Federalist Party. You guys don't need to know all this background. I'm just telling you guys because it's kind of interesting. But basically, Burr made the controversial move to try to take the election from his own running mate. And then this was really crazy. But all you need to know is about this amendment and election was that it essentially marked the beginning of the development of political parties and two-party system in America. And then again, the election of 1800 you do need to know about, because the election of 1800 was the first time there was a peaceful transfer of political party and power. So there was the peaceful transfer of power from one party to the other, and it showed America that their country could unite and work for the good of the nation, and it just showed other nations too that America knows what they're doing. So we could go to the next slide. Okay, so the 13th Amendment. So the 13th Amendment was passed in 1865, and it abolished slavery formally, but it really only chattel slavery, because there was still indentured servitude and so many other kinds of leasing, sharecropping, and slavery. So the 13th Amendment was necessary because even though the Emancipation Proclamation was issued by President Lincoln, it didn't actually end slavery entirely, because those especially enslaved in border states did not have been freed. And the 13th Amendment abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, where convict leasing and sharecropping were two practices that followed and the abolition of slavery. So this was still kind of a thing, and there's still remnants of all these crazy sharecropping and stuff. So convict leasing, as I said, was a system in which state and local governments would lease out prisoners to private businesses, and then these prisoners would be used as a source of labor. And a lot of African Americans were convicted of crimes, and they basically had to work for free, which was basically slavery, but just a different name for it, in a kind of legalized way. And then sharecropping was a system in which a landowner would allow a tenant to farm their land in exchange for a share of the crop. So this system was a new, again, for him, as coerced labor in the South, and it was used to help keep Black people tied to the land even after the abolition of slavery. And College Board directly states that the 13th Amendment is an example of increase in power of the federal government because it abolished slavery. So, yeah. Am I cutting for you guys? I'm looking at the chat. Am I cutting for you guys, or?
Helen, I think you're good now. It was just for a little, I think.
Okay. If it gets really bad, let me know. I'm gonna uncharge my laptop, but yeah. If you guys have and need me to repeat anything, just let me know. Okay. So yeah, 13, 14 Amendment, Ari, what you're saying, they're really important. And these are the amendments that are directly written in the APUSH CED. So you guys have to know them. Okay. So the 14th Amendment, and it granted Black people citizenship and equal protection under the laws. So after 1877, though, like after this amendment was kind of passed, the Jim Crow laws were also set in place. So it was like another counteractive move to just like it was so terrible for African Americans in the country. And then the Jim Crow laws, which are not like directly related to 14th Amendment, but it was like a counter-reactive measure. They are important because these like mandated racial segregation in public spaces and institutions like schools, etc. And it restricted the rights and opportunities and freedoms of Black people, such as equal access to public infrastructure and voting. And again, the Plessy versus Ferguson case that we just went over came after this, and it was used to justify and legitimize Jim Crow laws using separate but equal. So the 14th Amendment, even it was such a monumental piece of like legislation, but like still there was ways to get around that was used terribly. And it just showed that like racial segregation and discrimination still would exist heavily in the South. And like an example of that is the Black Codes, which were used to control the movement of newly freed Black people and to restrict their rights to property, work, legal representation, etc. And again, they were like usually jailed because a lot of things that like were normal were criminalized, such as vagrancy, which criminalized homelessness and unemployment. And many freed Black people were forced to work again for their former owners because they were like homeless and stuff like that. Yeah. Okay. So we could go on to the next slide. So the 15th Amendment, it granted all men, regardless of skin color, voting rights. However, there was ways, again, to get around this. Like, oh my gosh, Americans with all these terrible like ways to undo legislation that was so important. So, okay, there was intimidation, especially in like this, especially was always in the Southern American states. So there was like a lot of voter intimidation going on through like lynchings and shootings. And it was just so dangerous for like African Americans, especially to gain the right to vote. And white supremacy groups like the KKK were also contributing to a lot of this. And also at this time, like voter intimidation was like a crazy deal because like you couldn't really like hide your vote. Like there would be people like able to see your vote because so that's why voter intimidation was such a big deal then. And so there's so many examples of voter intimidation and like just violent crazy things like the Colfax massacre, where a white supremacist group killed at least 150 African American men in Colfax, Louisiana, after a disputed election. And this event to this day is considered one of the worst acts of racial violence in the United States. So I'm telling you guys, that is not that you directly need to memorize that massacre, but it would be like a nice source of outside evidence if you have something like that. And then again, there was ways to get around the suffrage because there's poll taxes, which created fees that were just like unattainable and really hard to pay up. There's literacy tests that were designed to be really difficult and subjective, and white election officials would be creating these polls and like tests, and a lot of African Americans were denied the right to vote, even if they were literate, because they didn't pass these ridiculous exams made by lots of white anti-Black voting. And then the grandfather clause. So this allowed people who were unable to pass the test to vote if their grandfathers were eligible to vote before the Civil War, because a lot of people were complaining that these literacy tests were hard, like including white Americans who were poor, like usually farmers. So they established a grandfather clause because a lot more white Americans had the ancestry who were able to vote. So this exemption was basically allowed to help white people further vote. But again, it just denied African Americans to vote, even if they were literate. It's just really crazy. So, oh, okay, I've thrown it. So basically, for the Cold Flax Massacre, that's pretty much it. It was like a white supremacist group because there was like a disputed election because African Americans were trying to also gain office too, and there was just so much like intimidation going on, and all these white supremacy groups were going like crazy, especially in the South. So it's just a good example to know, but like I don't think you would need to know more than that. And then what Zoe said too, the black codes restricted people's rights to own property and like conduct business. And then it just made life really difficult. And then for the Jim Crow laws, Taylor, Jim Crow laws were just set in place like around the 1870s, and these laws were basically in the South. And even though like there was so many legislation for African Americans, life was still so hard because they like legalized racial segregation, and Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court case, legalized and justified separate but equal. So there could be like separate institutions and like racial segregation, different buses, like for colored, for whites, and that was legal. Yeah, America is crazy. So we could go on to the next slide. Okay, so then again, as I said, 13, 14, 15, really important amendments. So 13, abolish slavery, 14 and 15 granted of African Americans citizenship, equal protection under laws, and voting rights. And then the women's rights movement was also actually emboldened and divided over the 14th and 15th amendments to the Constitution because segregation, violence, and Supreme Court decisions and local political tactics progressively stripped away African American rights. But the 14th and 15th amendments eventually became the basis for court decisions upholding civil rights in the 20th century. So these amendments, even though when they were passed right at their time, it like was still really hard, these amendments become really powerful to pass more progressive legislation such as the Civil Rights Act and etc. Okay. So this quote is directly from College Board, by the way. Okay. Then for the 16th Amendment, 16th Amendment is a really good example of a very progressive amendment and the progressive leaning of America at the time. So it authorized the federal government to collect an income tax and make the tax system more progressive. So by allowing Congress to levy a federal income tax, it helped pave up the way for prohibition. But World War I also helped stir the pot. And when Congress passed an income tax after the ratification of the 16th Amendment, the tax burden shifted to the rich for a while. So tax became like huge for like the richer and like lesser for the poor. And it was really progressive for its time, especially in the early 1900s. And on the national level, the progressives were really expanding their movement, and they sought federal legislation they believed that would help regulate the economy, expand democracy, generate moral reform. And these progressive amendments to the Constitution usually dealt with like issues like such as economy and taxing, like I just said, and also like women's suffrage, prohibition, etc. Yeah, Wilson was the president during this time. Okay. So next is the 19th Amendment, and it granted women suffrage the right to vote. And it was such a great achievement for suffragists and for women's rights in general because they were fighting for so long, as you could see in the Seneca Falls Convention, another good example of the fight to women's rights. And ratification of the 19th Amendment in the Constitution gave women the right to vote and a voice in politics. So this helped like really pave the way for greater political and economic opportunities for women in the future. And the suffrage movement also had a broader impact on American society as it helped to bring attention to the broader issue of gender inequality, and it laid the foundation for the modern feminist movement. So the suffrage movement just had a huge impact on American society and helped bring a lot of attention to the broader issue of gender inequality, and it laid the foundation for the modern feminist movement. Yeah, the 16th Amendment was a graduated income. So if you had more money, you basically paid more. It was just a good example of progressive reform and progressive legislation in the United States, which is why I went over it. But there's a chance it might not come up in your exam. Okay. So that was pretty much it with amendments. So if you guys have any like questions, you could just drop them in. If you're
I can answer that grandfather clause one. The grandfather clause was a loophole that allowed poor, uneducated white people to vote. So basically, if their grandfather could vote in 1860, then they wouldn't need to do a literacy test or they wouldn't need to pay a poll tax. So that was the trick because Black men couldn't vote in 1860. Were there voter intimidation tactics used against white women? No, not after the 19th Amendment, but before women had the right to vote. And I saw someone mention this in the chat, and it's an interesting point, but women have been fighting for the right to vote since the beginning of the country, but really specifically with the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. So when the 15th Amendment passed and Black men were given the right to vote, many white women, including some of like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, were angry that they lost this opportunity to vote. So there was a split between like white women who had been part of the abolitionist movement, abandoned it at that point because they were mad that they didn't get the right to vote. And then some of them went and voted anyway. In the 1876 election, Susan B. Anthony did, and she was arrested. And she made this really good speech at trial about why women should have the right to vote. So there wasn't any voter intimidation, but in the 1920s, when women had the right to vote, you see the beginning of women's rights. It's a huge turning point as women become more involved in the public sphere. What was the question that popped up on the screen?
It was someone asking about the 24th Amendment because it was also important to APUSH. Yeah. So basically it was just like during the civil rights, like heavy push of the movement. And it ended mandatory poll taxes that prevented like African Americans, people of color from voting. So, and also helped them to assimilate and get more like political power. But like it just really helped the Southern African Americans and other people of color. Yeah, I think that was it. Let me see if there's any other.
Just some of the things. What we're going to talk about presidents. This is what you guys asked for yesterday. And so as I go through the presidents now, I'm going to go over all of since basically 1792. So we're going to go over it, but we're not going to go over everything again. You can watch all the replays if you want to get that information. And also at the end of this tonight's slide, we have a full timeline with all of the events that happened. We're not going to go over that timeline. That's just for you guys to reference.
And guys, don't worry, because I'm seeing you guys like freak out being like, is this amendment important? Like, the amendments are good to know in general, but the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments are the ones that are most likely to pop up in your test because they're specifically stated in this course exam description. And if you guys need to go over them, just ask about them in chat or just check the slides. And now I'm handing it off to Andrea to go over the presidents.
Okay. So I want to preface the president's discussion in the same way. There's only a few presidents whose like names are going to show up. So I'm going to use this time in going over presidents to kind of highlight the big ones and to give you guys an overview of political parties and as they shifted and changed. We have a two-party system in this country, and now we've had Republicans and Democrats since the 19th century, but there was a lot in the early 19th century with different names. So we want to see how they evolved in the early 19th century, and I'll kind of touch upon that. The other piece about political parties is the best way to think about them is this political party a federalist party, meaning do they support giving more power to the federal government, or are they an anti-federalist party? Do they support giving more power to state governments and having a small, limited federal government? They are the first two political parties that emerged with the writing of the Constitution. Helen went over the Bill of Rights. That was an anti-federalist idea that we need to protect citizens from the power of the government. We're going to do that through a Bill of Rights, a list of all the things the government can't do. The names of the parties change, but that fundamental philosophy of government is going to continue. So I'll keep back to that as we go through the presidents. Conservatives, they change. Like the conservatives and liberals, those types of ideas change because it depends. Is the government being run by conservatives or liberals? So those are other good like buzzwords that I'll touch upon as we move through. So let's start with our first three presidents: Washington, Adams, and Jefferson. So this we call the early Federalist era, and it's a Federalist era, the time period, because this is the very beginning of the United States government, and this is the time that the federal government is defining who they are. How is this new experiment in democracy going to work? What is it going to look like to have a president, to have someone who's elected? Everybody living in the colonies at that time was used to monarchy. So this was like, how is this going to work? So George Washington is chosen to be the first president. He had really been a national figure since the 1750s and the French and Indian War. And he was also seen as by the founding fathers as just like the ideal executive, right? He was just a wonderful leader. He was a military leader. He also was like really intense on etiquette, super polite, just like a good like diplomat in those ways too. And so he's chosen to be president. He wasn't a part of a party, and actually one of his big warnings as he left office was, please don't split into these two factions. You're going to tear it apart. But we consider him a Federalist because he was the first head of the federal government, and everything he did set a precedent or a tradition. So I have these two words here under George Washington's first bullet. He's the first president with an S who sets precedents with a C. And a precedent is a tradition, it's a norm that gets followed. So he has a lot of them. One is this unwritten constitution. And that is anything he did that's not explicitly in the Constitution, but was continued. So he becomes president. He sets up a cabinet. He says, I need people to advise me. Creates Secretary of State. That's Thomas Jefferson. Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. We still have all these secretaries today, and that's one of the main pieces of the president. They need to assemble their team. That's the first thing they do. Another thing he does is after his second term, he steps down and he says, yeah, great. This is exactly what I'm talking about. He says, I need to move on so that this experiment can continue, so that you guys can elect someone and, right, like see how democracy works. That was never a rule. And it's not until the 20th century, and I'll talk about FDR, he runs and wins 4 terms. He wins 4 elections, that they amend the Constitution to set a 2-term limit. But it's just like a tradition. Everyone's like, George Washington did 2, I'm going to do 2. A couple presidents tried to go for 3, but we'll get to them when we go there. So he leaves after 2 terms. In his farewell address, he makes this warning about political parties, and he also tells Congress and the country that we're so young, we need to avoid political entanglements. we should trade as much as we can, but we shouldn't get involved in these messy alliances because the French Revolution was happening at that time. It was tearing apart the political parties, the Federalists under Hamilton and the Democratic Republicans under Jefferson. He says, let's just stay neutral. Those are the big things to know about Washington. John Adams comes in, another founding father from Massachusetts. Our first 7 presidents are exclusively from Massachusetts or Virginia. And he was okay. He only served 1 term, so that's always like, well, why? And that was really because there was this quasi-war with France, the XYZ affair. They sent some diplomats over to France, and the French diplomats, X, Y, and Z, that's the code names they were given, told the Americans, you need to pay $250,000 if you want to speak to Talleyrand, who was the foreign minister. And that was seen as an insult to Americans who, like, you know, we had a big sense of self at the time when no one else in the world really thought America was anything, that this thing was going to work. So it was seen as like an insult. So he passes the Alien and Sedition Acts, which made it more difficult to become a citizen. It increased the number of years you needed to be here. And that was because a lot of people were coming from France at that time, and they were leaning Democratic Republican against his party. So he was making it more difficult for them to vote. He also passes the Sedition Acts, which said you couldn't speak badly against the president. You couldn't speak badly against the Federalist Party. This was most likely unconstitutional, but because it was never challenged and it never went to the Supreme Court, we can't say for sure. The Supreme Court was also just defining who it was at the time. So Thomas Jefferson was his vice president because of that weird quirk in the Constitution that they fixed with the 12th Amendment. And so he runs in 1800, and he's a Democratic Republican. So I think Helen mentioned this before, but this is called the Revolution of 1800 because we have a peaceful transition of power from one political party to the next. That doesn't happen in monarchies, right? Where you have one king to the next and they just pass it off, like, here you go. So this again was seen as like a success. Oh, this can work, right? Like the people can vote someone in and then vote someone with totally different views and beliefs, and the country can keep going. So bright spot. We've had peaceful transition of power besides the Civil War, basically until 2021 and the insurrection. Thomas Jefferson is an anti-federalist. The anti-federalists become the Democratic Republicans. That's the party's name. But he is so intent on states' rights and a small, limited government that he does what he can to shrink. I'm going to talk about the Era Good Feelings next. To shrink the federal government. He doesn't want to be like a king. He used to show up at the door in his pajamas to like meet with foreign diplomats, and they all thought, you know, Americans were barbarians. But he did this purposefully to like bring down the power and prestige of the federal government because he believed, right, we should be more in tune with our state governments. Louisiana Purchase is another really big piece of his presidency, and it's a little contradictory. He wants to shrink the power of the federal government, and yet during his presidency, he purchases the Louisiana Territory, which doubles the size of the United States. And he's not exactly sure it's constitutional because it doesn't give president power to buy land, but he does it anyway for the good of the country, and right, kind of sets off the manifest destiny of the United States to expand from the East Coast to the West. So next slide is going to be the Era of Good Feelings. And this is James Madison, James Monroe, and John Quincy Adams. So these guys were, James Madison, James Monroe were also plantation owners from Virginia. So just like Jefferson and Washington, and they are Democratic Republicans. James Madison oversees the War of 1812, and after the War of 1812, the other party, the Federalist, really loses all of its power. So that's why it's called the era of good feelings, because there's really only one dominant political party and everybody was happy and America was expanding and there's growth and the market revolution's happening. This is period 4, and it kind of starts with a bang with this kind of growth of America. John Quincy Adams is an interesting guy. He was a Democratic Republican when he was president. And then after he was president, he's John Adams' son. He goes back to Massachusetts, and then he actually gets chosen to go back into Congress. And at that point, there's a new Federalist Party. They're called the Whigs at this time in the 1830s. And so he then becomes a Whig. So you don't need to know all that, but just I wanted to explain why there's 2 political parties there. So the American system was proposed, probably most associated with Henry Clay, but it really came into existence during James Monroe's presidency, and that was a way to tie the economies of the North and the South together. What's you see at play during the era of good feelings are Democratic Republicans are more states' rights focused, but you do need a federal government to connect all of these loose states into a federation. And so they do that through creation of the national road, these canals, tariffs, right? Support American businesses over foreign. These are all elements of the American system. Next, John Quincy Adams won the election of 1824 against Andrew Jackson, but it was a little sketchy. And so Andrew Jackson comes back with a vengeance in 1828. He wins the presidency with a surge of votes and support from the common man. At this time, you have universal white male suffrage, where they remove property qualifications from the state's voting requirements, and Andrew Jackson wins in a surge. So some things to know about Andrew Jackson is he is the first Democratic president. Same ideas as the Democratic Republicans, but he chops off that Republican part, and this becomes the Democratic Party, the one whose motto is the donkey, the same one we have today, even though their political beliefs, the issues are obviously completely different than they were in the 1820s and 30s. The Tariff of 1828 is passed during John Quincy Adams, and then that's known as the Tariff of Abominations. They pass another tariff in 1832, and that's the nullification crisis. It's all happening right at the same time. Andrew Jackson is really complicated and controversial, I think, is he's so interesting because it's like anything you say about him is true. He was an avid Indian fighter. He fought against Native American tribes in the Southwest. He was a land speculator. I saw somebody asking about the panic of 1819 and 1837. You don't really need to know about those besides the fact they have to do with land speculation. So speculation is when people go and they snap up all the land, they buy it cheap, then they split it up into plots and sell it for a profit. So you had a lot of that going on because they were stealing all this land from Native Americans. And Andrew Jackson was supporting that, including with the Indian Removal Act. He is succeeded by Martin Van Buren, kind of his hand-picked successor. And so you don't really need to know about him. Anything that happens during his presidency, including the Trail of Tears and the Panic of 1837, are attributed to Andrew Jackson because they are things that were set into motion during his presidency. Next slide. So there's a bunch of presidents in the after Martin Van Buren and before Abraham Lincoln. So it'd be the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, but you don't need to know any of them. Someone who might come up is James K. Polk, and all you need to know about him is he's president. He's a manifest destiny president. He wins election at this time because he is pretty forthright about wanting to acquire more land. And so I included this map so we just briefly could go over westward expansion. The 13 original colonies, and then all that green was, guys, you don't need to know the panics. They've never ever come up. Don't even worry about them. You need to know about economic bust. It's going to be the Great Depression. And we'll talk about that. So the green is all the land we won in the Revolution from Great Britain. Louisiana Purchase was bought from France. You should see a pattern here. European nations claiming land that belonged to different Native American tribes. And so the US government's going to have to fight and displace all these different tribes, starting in the late 18th century and all the way through the early 20th century. Texas wins its independence from Mexico in 1836, but at that time, I can't even remember who was president then. Doesn't matter. They wouldn't allow it to become part of the Union. So Texas is an independent republic for about 10 years until Polk comes in and says, we're going to annex Texas. We're also going to provoke Mexico into a war. And when we win that war, we're going to get all of this land in the southwestern part of the United States. So that's California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and part of Colorado. That's all you need to know about Polk. Next one. So moving on ahead, I mentioned earlier, but the Whigs, who are the New Federalists, they emerge in the 1830s, basically just in opposition to Andrew Jackson. They are Federalists, but their defining factor is they hate Andrew Jackson, who is the states' rights guy. That's not enough to keep them together, and they have differing views on slavery. And so in the 1850s, 40s and 50s, you see a splintering of political parties because there's lots of different issues. You got the Free Soilers who want to end slavery. You've got the Know Nothing who are nativists and they want to end immigration. At this point, immigration is coming from Ireland and Germany. There's those are the two big ones. There's the National Unionists, the Constitutionalists, all these different political parties. They coalesce in the 1854 under the Republicans, and their defining factor is no expansion of slavery into the territories. So they nominate Abraham Lincoln in 1860. He ran for Senate and lost in 1858. But he gained this national platform. He wins. 11 states who are Democratic states say, if Lincoln's president, he's going to take away our right to own slaves. We're leaving the Union and forming the Confederacy. This leads to the Civil War. And really all you need to know about Lincoln in that case is he wanted to preserve the Union. He was dedicated to that. And it wasn't until 1863, in the middle of the war, that the moral changes to end slavery. And that's with the Emancipation Proclamation, which was ultimately a military strategy and not a moral stance. But it does change the war to a crusade to end slavery. Suspension of habeas corpus is an example of habeas corpus is part of your due process. So if you're arrested, you need to be told what you're arrested about. It's part in the Bill of Rights. This is a suspension of that, and it shows that during wartime, presidents are going to grasp and take more power. And we'll see this, especially as we move through the 20th century, when presidents seize power in like a moment of national security, they don't release it, right? That power then gets assumed by the federal government. So you see that kind of throughout the 20th century with all the big wars we're in. Abraham Lincoln is assassinated at the end of the war, and he doesn't. And so he wins the 1860 election, and then in 1864, he runs on the ticket with Andrew Johnson, who's a Democrat from Tennessee. And a lot of what Lincoln does throughout the war is to retain these border states. The border states were slave states that hadn't seceded from the Union. So they elect Lincoln and Johnson to try to get Southern Democrats to support him. Take that back. To get Northern Democrats to support Abraham Lincoln in 1864 when everybody was tired of the war, not knowing that Lincoln's going to be assassinated and Andrew Johnson is now going to be in charge of Reconstruction. So he's a Democrat from Tennessee. He grew up poor, so he hated slavery, not because he wanted like slaves to be free, but because he resented and hated rich white slave owners. And he didn't like the power that they had as plantation owners. He was very racist. He did not care about Black people. And so when Reconstruction is now in his hands, he follows with Lincoln's 10% plan, but then he butts heads with Congress every step of the way. Congress is a radical Republican Congress. They want to punish the South for what they did, and they want to extend equality to the former slaves through voting rights and economic opportunities. Basically, every time Congress passes something, Johnson vetoes it. They override his veto because they have the majority, and it leads to the first impeachment. The impeachment was like they passed a law, this like tenure of office act, like knowing he would break it so that they could impeach him. But he is not removed from office. So hopefully we know, because this just happened twice in our history. But the House of Representatives impeaches the president, and then it goes as a trial to the Senate, and they decide, are they going to remove the president or not? And Andrew Johnson does not lose his job by one vote. And apparently this guy like called up Johnson the next day and said, I kept you in office and now you owe me a favor. So it was a political move, as most of these things are. He does not win re-election. And then we move to probably my favorite slide of the night. The forgettable presidents. We're not going to spend much time because nobody cares about these guys. These are the presidents during the Gilded Age. As you can see, they're all Republicans except for Grover Cleveland. And so what we need to know about these Republicans, right? You don't need to know the specific presidents, but the Republican ideology shifts during this time, really in 1877 with Rutherford B. Hayes. They don't care about Reconstruction anymore. They don't really care about Black people. They let the South do what they want, return to home rule. And Republicans become the party of industrialists. During the Gilded Age, you have massive wealth being created in the United States and being hoarded by industrialists. So these are the factory owners, the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts. And the Republicans do all they can to support business. And so this is the beginning of part of the Republican ideology of today, which is a pro-business approach. Moving on. Modern America. So now we're getting into the 20th century. William McKinley is president as Republicans go from doing progressive things to industrial things. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. You know, progressive, the radical Republicans were definitely progressive. They were ahead of their time in many ways. And then they become laissez-faire Republicans, right? So they want to limit the role of the federal government. But the irony, I think, is during the Gilded Age, and this is included for William McKinley, is to give like power and privileges to the industrialists, to the rich people. And they're consolidating all of their power through monopolies and trusts. So we'll see kind of how the government deals with that. So William McKinley is elected in 1896. He runs against William Jennings Bryan. And somebody mentioned earlier in the chat, they saw that Cross of Gold speech in their SAT, which is funny. So William Jennings Bryan is like the ultimate loser. He just like keeps running for president and losing, and then loses the Scopes monkey trial. But he was proponent of working men. William McKinley is proponent of the industrialists. Carnegie, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, they put money up to get McKinley elected. So you know who he's going to support during his time in office. He also is, and kind of what you need to know about him, is pro-imperialist. He is president during the Spanish-American War. He annexes Hawaii, which in the 1880s, this guy, a group of American businessmen, overthrow the Queen of Hawaii, imprison her in her palace, and then ask America to annex Hawaii because they don't want to pay tariffs. They want people to get plantation goods and crops cheaper. I think it's Grover Cleveland at the time says, no, what you did to the Queen was wrong. William McKinley says, great, you're going to come and become the next territory. And Hawaii eventually becomes the 49th state, I believe, or 50th. Not sure with Alaska. He also is a huge supporter of the Philippine-American War. So when the U.S. wins Spanish-American War, they win Puerto Rico, Guam, and then they buy the Philippines out from Spain in the midst of their own independence movement, Philippines. McKinley famously says we need to like uplift and civilize and Christianize the Philippines, ignoring the fact that they had been colonized by Spain for 300 years and most of them were Catholic. But it's a very kind of racist ideology, and it ignites this debate in the United States over imperialism. McKinley wins the election of 1900, and it's seen as a mandate for the United States to pursue its imperialist agenda. He's assassinated in 1901 and by an anarchist, and Teddy Roosevelt takes his place. This is like one of the biggest come-ups. Teddy Roosevelt had been the governor of New York, and the New York State legislature couldn't stand him. They annoyed him so much that they say, hey, you should go be vice president, because vice president doesn't really do anything, doesn't have much power. And then, of course, he gets elevated to president after the assassination. He's a Republican, but he's the first of our progressive presidents. So with Roosevelt, you have the progressive era. What is progressive about him? He's a trust buster, as are Taft and Wilson. All three of these guys use the power of the presidency to break up powerful monopolies and trusts, and they're using like the Sherman Antitrust Act. Taft is the one who breaks up the Standard Oil, right? It goes to the Supreme Court. They break up Standard Oil, Rockefeller's company, into these little, baby standards like ExxonMobil and Chevron, which we still have today. He also proposes what's called the Square Deal, and this was a package of legislation that was meant to help Americans. Again, that's progressive. He's not looking out for only the business owners, but he's looking out for the American people. At this time, the United States is going through massive immigration, urbanization, and the Square Deal is protecting American consumers, right? Like the FDA is created under Teddy Roosevelt so that, the federal government becomes a regulatory agency. They're going to make sure that people are, that companies are doing what they say they're doing. He's also a big conservationist. So this is the very beginning of a conservationist movement. Companies can't pollute. willy-nilly, right? Like they have to rein it in. He starts the United States Forest Service. He wants to make sure, and this is his main philosophy, and I have seen this come up a lot on the exam. This idea of conservation is that public land should be conserved for future public use. So he's not saying you can't use it, but he's saying we need to use it responsibly. And that's a really big, important piece of the progressive era, that we're going to like be responsible, right? And make sure that things are good for people. So that contrasts with preservation, which you might see associated with like John Muir, who was like the head of the Sierra Club, who said we need to preserve land in its utmost form just because it's beautiful and nice to look at, but we're not using it. So Roosevelt and Muir got along, but they had a little bit of different philosophies about what we should do. Teddy Roosevelt supported preservation through the establishment of national parks, right? You just go to a national park to enjoy the scenery, to hike, to camp, to just see nature. But then he also has things like the Forestry Service, which are meant to make sure we have enough wood, right? So we can continue to use it. Big stick energy is the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, where he says we need to speak softly and carry a big stick. He's an imperialist president, just like McKinley. He supports a revolution in Panama so that we can build the Panama Canal there. He actually goes over to Panama to see the construction of the canal, and he's just like a wild guy. I love Teddy Roosevelt. He's probably my favorite president. He's like huge energy. He made a lot of speeches, but he was just like a really like loud, boisterous guy. He's followed by Taft, who was his handpicked successor. Taft was also a trust buster, even more than Teddy Roosevelt. Probably what everybody knows about Taft is he was pretty large and he got stuck in the bathtub in the White House. What does trust buster mean? Great question. It means that you're breaking up monopolies. So like that, the power of corporations, they would basically pool their money into these trusts. And so the companies were then responsible only to the shareholders and not to the consumers. So when you have a monopoly, like one company might run that whole industry. So Rockefeller ran Standard Oil. So if you were getting oil in America at this time, you were getting it from Standard Oil. And that's because he would put other oil refinery, other companies out of business with his really ruthless tactics. And so Congress passes the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890 and the Clayton Antitrust Act in 1909 to break up these trusts and what they see as actually hurting capitalism if you don't have competition. And so this is a progressive, very progressive move, right, for the government to get involved. And it's the opposite of laissez-faire capitalism, where you just let the market do what it's going to do. What else was I going to say about Taft? He made a couple mistakes, and Teddy Roosevelt got so mad that he actually came back and ran against Taft, his friend, in 1912 under a third party called the Bull Moose Party. And Taft and Roosevelt split the Republican ticket, and that's how Woodrow Wilson got elected. Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat. He was the president of Princeton University, like kind of this like nerdy academic guy. But he was also very progressive, also a trust buster. He campaigns in 1916 on keeping the United States out of the war. But then, whoops, the United States gets into World War I in 1917. Woodrow Wilson oversees it. He nationalizes all these industries to create this like war machine. And he's also pretty racist. He did a showing of Birth of a Nation, a really racist movie. He under his administration, you see the reemergence of the Ku Klux Klan in a slightly different vein. They still are a hate group against Black people in the South, but because of all this immigration, they kind of expand their hatred to Catholics, Jews, and women who are like emerging into like public life. And Woodrow Wilson was not a KKK member, but he allowed them to come back onto the national scene, where eventually in 1924 they're going to put a KKK member up for like nomination for president. The 1920s in general, you see the reemergence of the KKK. So 1920s is a big like backlash to the progressive era.
What the fuck is it?
What does it mean? Does that mean he was also anti-Semitic? Woodrow Wilson. I'm not sure about that. I haven't seen like specific evidence of that. I wouldn't be surprised, but also I can't say he was unless I saw something like that. Zoe, can we go to the next slide? So the 1920s is a backlash to the progressive era. And what we have after World War I is 3 Republican presidents. I saw you guys talking about this earlier. You had it right. It's Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. What you need to know about them is pro-business Republicans. This is back to those forgettable presidents. Laissez-faire capitalism. They're going to let business do what they want. And during Warren G. Harding's, you also have the immigration quotas that are put in place. And those are preventing immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. A lot of that is fear after the Russian Revolution. That first Red Scare happens under Harding. And Teapot Dome scandal was a scandal during the time. It was the biggest scandal until Watergate, and then Watergate was the biggest scandal. But now we're so inundated with scandals that some of them lose their flair, but it was a big deal back then. Herbert Hoover is president during the stock market crash. He's elected in 1828. Everything crashes in October of 1929. And because he was this laissez-faire Republican, he didn't believe that the government should do anything about it, right? Like, we had these boom and bust cycles. We had panics before, but the market corrects itself, right? Like, that was the belief. And so he said, I'm not going to do anything about it. There was also a belief that comes from this Republican ideology that the definition of laissez-faire is that the government does not get involved in the economy. So they're not going to regulate businesses. They're going to allow businesses to do what they want. I think it literally means like hands off. So someone can correct me if they speak French, but that's a good way to remember it. It's like a hands-off government. So he believes that like people are starving during the Great Depression. Starts in 1929 and continues to its peak in 1933. People are losing their jobs. They're homeless. These tent cities pop up in like Central Park in New York City and just like the outskirts of all the cities because everybody lost their job. They can't pay rent and now they're just trying to like live. They call those Hoovervilles. People would pull their pockets out and call empty pockets Hoover flags. Everything blamed it on him because he didn't do anything to help. There was the bonus army, was a group of World War I veterans who said, hey, we need our bonuses. And they like gas them when they show up to protest on Washington. So next slide is the biggie, FDR and a radical transformation of the power of the federal government. So Zoe, hit to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, so FDR becomes president he's elected in 1932. And fun fact, inaugurations were always in March because back in the day they needed to give presidents a lot of time to like get there. But with modern travel, they move up the inauguration to January because they want FDR to like get on it so quickly. Immediately becoming elected, he starts to assemble what's called the Brain Trust, and he says, "We are going to fix this Great Depression." He passes a slew of legislative acts known as alphabet soup, right? The New Deal programs, they're relief, recovery, and reform. Relief is really short term, get people money right now so they can buy food, help the farmers so they can produce that food. Recovery is so we can recover, like the economy can recover from the Depression, so get people jobs, set like codes and standards across industries. And then reform, a lot of that was banking reform, make sure that stuff like this won't happen again. All those three big goals of the New Deal completely transform the way the United States government works. This is liberalism. This is the belief, and it's the opposite of laissez-faire. It's the belief that the government can fix problems, right? And so it's similar to the progressive era, but it's like at a whole new level. And you also have the creation of Social Security. A Social Security is like a social safety net. Money gets taken out of your paycheck every week, and it goes to support people who are retired right now. And then ultimately, when you retire, you get supported by people that are working. So this was to prevent, like in the Great Depression, people lost their life savings. And if they were older and they had no money and they lost all their money, then they were just kind of out of luck. So this created a way that retirees, widows, dependents could get money in case of catastrophe or old age, either one. He was incredibly popular. He wins election in 1932, 1936, 1940, and 1944. So 4 times. As I mentioned, they put term limit on the president after he dies in office in 1945. He also, as he's dealing with the Great Depression and these domestic, this was an economic catastrophe, the greatest one the United States ever faced. He's also preparing the United States to get involved in World War II, right? Like 1930s is also the rise of fascism in Europe. He's got his eye on that, and he's slowly preparing a very isolationist America to get into this war. 1941, the United States is bombed by the Japanese in Pearl Harbor, and the U.S. gets into the war, and then everything becomes war-focused. FDR leads the way, leads us to a victory. He also authorizes during this time the Manhattan Project, which is the creation of the atomic bomb, nuclear power, and the United States does that. They become the first superpower because we've got the power of the atomic bomb. He also had polio and didn't have the use of his legs. He was in a wheelchair, but a lot of people didn't know because he would do these fireside chats. He would speak on the radio. Obviously, they didn't have like the TV of today. And so he was just like, so many people only knew FDR as their president. And he was like this calming, really competent force for people. So when he died in 1945, there was, it was devastating for America. But you also had a lot of people who disagreed with his philosophy of government. And we have a smattering of Republicans and Democrats, basically for the rest of the 20th and now 21st century, that are debating this fundamental question. Is it the federal government's responsibility to look after its citizens? Democrats say yes, it is, and Republicans say no, it is not the federal government's responsibility, and they do everything they can to rein in the federal government. So we'll see that kind of play out in the next few slides. I think we only have like 2 or 3 more. So our Cold War presidents. we just went over this last night. A lot happens during the Cold War, foreign policy and domestic policy. You want to know, we're going to talk about like societal changes next, so that'll cover a lot of this stuff. But Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, who I don't even include, and then Carter were your presidents during the Cold War, and then Reagan and Bush we'll talk about in a second. They kind of are all, even though you have some Republicans in the mix, they're all pretty liberal. They all are continuing the New Deal, or under Johnson, they expanded to the Great Society. Even Richard Nixon, who's Republican, he creates the EPA, like he scales back on the Cold War with détente. Obviously, he's most known for being the only president to resign, but a lot of his actions were pretty liberal in those cases. Polar presidents, yeah. So Eisenhower, another Republican, he was super like moderate. Like this is the time of liberalism. Then we have a backlash to that, and we also talked about this yesterday with this new conservatism. So you can move to the next slide, and Reagan Revolution. So next slide will take us to 1980 and a backlash to the New Deal, to the Great Society, to this idea that the federal government can help citizens. Reagan famously said, like, the 6 words you never want to hear is, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." That might be more than 6 words, but he also says the government's not the solution, it's the problem. Like, his view is we need to go back to laissez-faire economics. His idea is tax cuts to the wealthy and corporations. They'll invest and it'll trickle down to the American people. He wants to scale back federal welfare programs to rein in the federal government. This is the Republican ideology of today, right? Small, limited federal government against the Democrats who believe in the power of the federal government. Going back to what I said before, it's really hard once the government like gains a power to take it back. And people like social programs, right? Like they like that helping. And so you see that playing out over the next few years. If you go to our next slide, this increasing polarization of the 1990s and the early 2000s is like, what does America want? Do we want a Democratic like president? Do we want a Democratic government that invests in people and gives money to people and programs and businesses? Or do we want a small, limited government, tax cuts, right? Like, it's the big question. So we keep flipping back and forth, and that's because we can't really decide where we are, right? Like, there's a lot. But you don't need to know this for the exam. You just need to know this for life and where we are right now in politics. And questions about presidents, what I just went over. If there's any in the Q&A, you guys can send them to the screen. If not, I'll kind of look into the chat. The Teapot Dome scandal was basically the Secretary of the Interior was selling public land, so government's land, to private companies and pocketing the money. That was it. That was like the big scandal of the time. We have a scandal like that like every day now. Government corruption. Yeah, please take a break if you'd like. Got to take care of yourself. And if you have questions, let me know. It's 8:51, so let's say break until like 8:58. Is that good? 7 minutes? Can I explain stagflation? Absolutely. So stagflation was the economic crisis of the 1970s. We're not going to do a quiz today. We're going to focus on the content. So stagflation is a combination of a stagnant economy with inflation. So generally, economists would see that if the economy is doing well, right? People have jobs, people have more money to spend, then prices rise, right? And that's inflation. That's happening right now. But in the 1970s, prices were rising or inflating, but there was high unemployment and the economy was stagnant. And so it was like a conundrum. Economists are like, well, we didn't know. We thought that it was always this like inverse relationship. It was because the government had spent so much money in Vietnam and on the Great Society programs that they were printed too much money, and that was what was leading to the inflation. The unemployment was because there were so many baby boomers who were entering the job force. Women were entering the job force in the 1970s, the workforce, I should say, at very high numbers. And so there just weren't enough jobs at a time when foreign competition, like from Japan and Germany, like the World War II countries were now recovered from World War II. They were producing a lot of goods. The United States was buying more than it was selling. And our economy was shifting from a manufacturing economy, which we had been since the Industrial Revolution, into a service economy, which is what we have now. And so all of these things come together to create stagflation and this like economic question that Nixon, Ford, Carter all tried to deal with and didn't work. And then the Reagan Revolution, this idea of like tax cuts and trickle down had a short-term effect. And so people look to that as like an example of like how to fix a flailing economy. What else? When did the parties switch? So 1930s, definitely. The Democrats had always been like, you have the Dixiecrats, those are the Southern Democrats, states' rights proponents. And then in the North, there had always been Democrats who were more like city, like local governments, like cities had always been like run by Democrats because they're all about small local government. So FDR, was one of those Democrats. I think he was the governor of New York. And you have the belief that the federal government should like conquer problems in 1930s. And then Democrats switch over to Republicans in 1968 and into the 70s over the issue of civil rights. And that was like Nixon's Southern strategy, was to pick off those Southern Democrats from what he felt was like they were being alienated by the Democratic Party and bring them over to the Republicans, like through kind of like racist terminology, like law and order and stuff like that, and in this backlash to the civil rights movement. We go over pre and immediate post-Jackson period again. The pre-Jackson was the era of good feelings, and post-Jackson was the emergence of the second party system. And so you have the Democrats and then eventually the Whigs, which form in opposition to Jackson. How much of the AP exam is going to ask specifics about Indian tribes? So you might have a question asking about like the different regions of the United States and how their climate and geography affected Native American tribes. I've seen a short answer question like that before. Then the other ones you will see like maybe about the Plains Wars. Basically, like as the United States expanded west, they came in contact with different tribes. So like the Treaty of Greenville were the Ohio River Valley tribes. Then during Jackson, you have the southeastern tribes. And then during the Plains Wars, you have the like Plains Indian tribes. You would have a question about it, but it's always going to ask, like, how was the government like making decisions for Native American tribes? But they're not going to ask like who were the Sioux or where are the Sioux located. It's not going to be like that. They'll give you the information you need, and you should be able to figure it out if you understand basically like the broken treaties of the federal government. Dawes Severalty Act is something that could come up for sure. That was a way that the federal government stole land from Native Americans. They had put them on reservations, and then they took their land and they broke it up into plots, and then they sold it off to white people so that they could live side by side with Native Americans and learn like the white man's ways, which was farming, and basically just stole their land. In what president's term did the Berlin Wall fall? That was in George H.W. Bush's term, 1989. The Dawes Act was in 1887. Ooh, who was the president that supported the grandeur movement? That's a great question. No president. William Jennings Bryan ran for president in 1896, and he got the support of the populists. The populists were the farmers, right? The grandeur movement was more local, but when they became a national party, they became the populists, or the People's Party. And they lost that election to William McKinley in 1896. Oh, so it's 8:58. Let's move. Danila's going to take us through some big societal changes and movements. So keep those questions coming. And we're also going to go over DBQ. And then we'll have some time at the end to just answer any last questions you guys have. You probably don't need to know the Incas and the Aztecs. A question could come up about like de las Casas, but really that would be period one, and I would be surprised if something like that came up. All right, Danila, take it away.
Okay, all right, guys. So I'll be going over like cultural and social changes from period 1 to period 9. We'll be going through this kind of lightning fast, but I'll slow down and stop like between every few slides or so to explain a few things. All right, so let's get to it. All right, I already see everybody, their eyes are closing as soon as I mention European, Native, and African interactions. Every single time, without fail, every time I mention triangle trade, everybody goes silent. But you really need to understand this, because there could be a question somehow about continuity or cultural changes in this time. So here we have like the birth of a new society, right? With a clash between Native Americans, Europeans, and Africans produced a new society in the North and South Americas. And it all started with the beginnings of the interactions when the settlers, when 1607, the group of English settlers arrived in Jamestown, Virginia, as a part of like the joint stock company called the Virginia Company. Like, come on, guys, you ever seen Pocahontas? Remember that song, because that's the only way I remember like the Virginia Company. So these English settlers encountered many indigenous tribes, which commonly are referred to like the Powhatan Nation. Right. So there were like we interacted with many of these indigenous tribes, and there are a lot of sources of tension. The first one is English desire to acquire land. So the English and the natives actually, the English and natives often clashed on the desire for land because, number one, the English didn't understand why the natives loved it so much. The natives loved it because it was a valuable spiritual and cultural resource to them. and they often resisted European control through military and diplomacy in this time. And there's also, in this time, we have new justifications for the subjugation of natives. Like you'll probably be asked a question somehow about the Spanish encomienda system and the case systems, which all were systems of subjugation with the Spanish. And the English frequently tried to convert. I shouldn't just say the English. It was the English, Dutch, and the Spanish who were trying to who converted the natives to Christianity and often exploited them for economic gain. And also the English planters, as a result of like coming in and colonizing the place, they completely altered the land that the natives were dependent on. And also the natives were completely decimated by European diseases. When you think of triangular trade, it was not only a trade of goods, people, but also diseases, like I want to say smallpox and the flu. Am I right about that? I think it's smallpox and the flu, but I would just say the smallpox just in case I'm wrong about the flu. There were also large cultural differences. If ever you were asked to explain cultural differences between them, like we had Europeans who were typically Christian, like Protestant, Catholic, and I'm not going to summarize the natives' beliefs, but they often clashed with the European monotheism. And European societies were often like the societies we live in now. They were hierarchical with unequal power structures with men above women, but native societies are more egalitarian with equal roles of men and women and such. And there's also, if you ever want to do like a contrasting thing, there were sources of like cooperation where the English learned how to cultivate the land from the natives, and in return, the natives traded firearms and iron tools with the English. The one example I remember the most is with the French and the natives, who, like in the way my teacher explained it, were somewhat peaceful. But this came at the cost of the natives having a complete over reliance on these weapons and tools. And if we want to talk about European and African interactions, you could talk about this for hours. But in summary, it was the transatlantic slave system led to like almost the complete decimation of Africa and like the toppling of their societies. Okay, next slide. Okay, colonial culture. This is in period 2, colonial culture and society. So here I want to explain that America had a lot of religious diversity, right? Protestantism was the dominant religion, but we have Jewish people in New York and Jersey, repping Jersey here. Catholics, we have mostly in Meriden, the Puritans in New England, and the South was mainly the Anglican Church, right? So we had the First Great Awakening in the 1700s, which led to more religious denominations, new methods of preaching, and it also rebelled against the strict Puritans. And some way you can connect the First Great Awakening is to the later ideas of transcendentalism and romanticism as we get into like the more revolutionary periods. But in this time, culture was almost imitated from the British. Right? Colonies had governments based off of British people, and some New York and New Jersey elites would mimic like British elite pastimes, like drinking tea and etiquette and smoking tobacco. Ugh, okay, whatever. But if you ever wanted to say like the beginning of like, I want to say beginning of American identity, it's the salutary neglect, where it led to our idea of self-rule and independence, at least the beginnings of it. Please stop talking about our traffic. Please, it's not that bad. Next slide. All right, guys. So you don't like the people I represent with like the Enlightenment and the Revolution. You know, we have the idea of natural rights, separation of powers, social contract, and all these ideas led to, in the revolutionary period, it led to a unified national identity, and also we also see a rise of mass democracy, ideas of democracy. Like people, like everyone should have a vote, everyone should have a voice in your government. We have ideas of individual autonomy, like ideas like get your money up and everything like that. We also have religious freedom, which is where we which is kind of what the colonies were based off of. So it's not surprised that we'd see that in the Enlightenment. And we also see that immigration contributed to increased population in America from 1750 to 1800. I remember doing a practice like MCQ or SAQ on this, and it was horrible for me. So like really think about that. Don't be like me and forget that. So we had mainly immigration from like England, Germany, and Ireland, and they often left for economic opportunities, religious persecution, or they're escaping war or natural disasters. And in the Enlightenment and Revolutionary period, we see the ideas of Republican motherhood, that a woman's role is important as a political figure in the home. So we start to see sometimes increased political participation for women, but also some increased education for women. But here's a continuity. We still have, even after the American Revolution, we still have the continuation of slavery and displacement of native populations, which would continue until way, way later. Hold on. Okay, now we can go to the next slide. Okay, so now we're getting into the idea of, it was actually aloe vera, so this time. So we have the regional culture, where we start to see the beginnings of sectionalism in the United States, you know what I mean? Like the South was largely influenced by the legacy of slavery and the plantation system, and the North was currently being shaped by the rise of industry and urbanization, right? We also see romanticism. And transcendentalism, which were all based off of, what was it? Oh, the rejection of rationalization because of the Enlightenment. People were like, guys, why are you so into sciences? When did we start getting like this? It's more like we're gonna go to God, and we're trying to see like the beauty in life. I recommend reading some transcendentalist poetry. It's nothing like you've ever seen before. Nothing like you've seen. And in this period, we have the man, the myth, the legend, the manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was destined to expand its territory from coast to coast, right? And we also have the market revolution, which I see a lot of, we also have market revolution, which I see a lot of questions about. So it took place in the early 19th century, a period of economic growth and transformation, and characterized by increased use of like new transportation technologies like steamboats and railroads, which allowed for rapid movements of goods across the country. All this leading to the rise of a market economy where goods and services are exchanged through buying and selling rather than bartering or self-sufficiency. It brought about significant changes in society, like the rise of factory productions and the growth of cities, and which all led to the growth of a new working class composed of like factory workers and urban dwellers. And this all led to the development of new forms of labor, like wage labor, and new forms of social organization, like trade unions. Recommend everybody has to join a trade union. Stay safe, y'all. For women in this century, we have, although many women found opportunities for work outside the home, societal expectations and the cult of domesticity placed pressure on women to prioritize their roles of wives and mothers over their roles as workers. It led to a gender divide where men were seen as providers and leaders in the public sphere, while women were expected to be caretakers and moral guides in the private sphere. Even despite this, many women still found ways to work and earn money through domestic service or working in factories like the Lowell girls. And the majority of working women were single, and married women were often discouraged from working outside the home. And also This sentiment led to like the rise of social Darwinism, the belief that society should allow the strongest and most capable individuals to rise to the top, while the weaker individuals should be left to fall. Yeah, it was used to justify the inequality and the poverty that existed in society because it was an inevitable result of survival of the fittest. It does ignore some larger societal economic structures and perpetuates inequality. So social Darwinism in this century like includes like justification for colonialism and imperialism, the support for eugenics or the belief that the human race can improve by selective breeding and the sterilization of unfit individuals, which includes like disabled people, black people, Jewish people at sometimes. Sometimes I saw yeah, real weird. And we also see like increased support for like abolitionists, like oh my god, I lost my thought. Right. We also see increased support for abolitionists and stuff like that. I want to say like think of a Frederick Douglass and such in that vein. We also see like the rise of immigration because more people are still immigrating from places like from Europe. I want to say like Eastern Europe. Am I right about that? Can someone corroborate that? Like Eastern Europe, please, if I'm wrong, say something. But
during period 4, it's Western Europe.
Okay, Western Europe, right? And because of all these Western Europeans are settling into these tenements and apartments and getting jobs in factories, so we see a boom in what do you call those people? The lower level unskilled laborers. You see a rise in unskilled laborers, and of course you see, because of all this new immigration, you see the rise of nativism, which is essentially xenophobia in the modern day. It is the belief that it really was just a racist belief founded in the idea that these immigrants should not be coming in taking our jobs. Only true Americans should be here. You'll see nativism rise in the coming centuries, like you'll see nativism rise in the coming centuries. So I'd count that as like a continuity, but the change would be the explosion of immigration. Okay, now we can go on to period 5. Okay, so we see after the Second Great Awakening, it urged Americans to change their society for the better. So we see antebellum reform movements. We call this the temperance movement, which was a movement composed mainly of middle-class women who were saying that it was our duty in society to get rid of all these social ills, starting with banning alcohol. We had public school movements, which was a movement for getting greater education and like opening up education to like the public, which is why you still have to be, that's why you're listening here with me today. We have women's rights movements with the Declaration of Sentiments and all that. And we also see the continuation of abolitionist movements as people who are as religious spheres start to get into the idea that slavery is wrong. I mean, like, who knew, right? And we also have sectionalist tensions as the country continued to expand to the west. Remember, Manifest Destiny, regional divisions deepen. We see the U.S. immigration changes. We see Irish people and Catholics in the north. We have we have Mexicans and Chinese to the west. But there's also a lot of racial backlash to Mexicans and Chinese people, and also the Irish and the Catholics. And many of these people that you'll see, like, there's more of like a continuity in this period. Always remember the ethnic enclaves. Like, I want to explain it. Think of it like town. think of it like settling in like Chinatown. You know what I mean? That people of like to maintain their culture, people of like ethnic background will live together. And also another cause of sectional tensions was the North industrialized far faster because of the market revolution. And the antebellum reform movements like only deepened the divide between like King Cotton in the South and the North's industrialization. So they start to grow further and further apart. And we also see sectionalist tensions over slavery and people trying to keep the Union, people trying their hardest to keep the Union together. And so fast forward, I know it's a little bit of a fast forward, but after the Civil War, we have enslaved men that are freed with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that we went over earlier. But we also see the failures of Reconstruction, like Black codes and the Jim Crow and the KKK, which were all used to make sure African Americans could not properly express their constitutional rights. So we still have a long, long ways to go for racial equality. Ooh, westward expansion and labor. Guys, I love the Labor Party. It is my favorite. It's one of my favorite units. I know I say that for every unit, but I'm being so serious. Remember labor in the Gilded Age. So we have like westward. So first we have westward expansion, right? Reservationist. I want to talk about reservationist policies when it pertains to Native Americans. So essentially what we did was we decided that it was our duty to put these people in a designated land. And as we continued moving westward, their lands just got smaller and smaller. And all these Native Americans were looking to this being like, hey, can we maybe have our land back and maybe have a few rights? So we have Native American resistance we see in ghost dances that were ultimately used as a resistance movement to like colonial expansion. It was based on the spiritual belief that the dead have returned to bring back their world and rid it of white oppressors, and it involved dancing, singing, chanting, and thought to bring like a spiritual renewal of the earth. These movements were like brutally put down by the Wounded Knee massacre. Yeah, these were brutally put down in the Wounded Knee massacre, which was the last major armed conflict between the United States and specifically the Plain Indians. They responded. They wanted to reclaim the Sioux wanted to reclaim their reservation, and many Sioux men, women, and children were killed, and the United States did not have that many casualties. We also have like we also have like farming in the frontier, where we're starting to see the frontier we all see the frontier beginning to close, right? So because of the failing prices of agricultural goods and rising railroad rates, and also because of monopolies like Standard Oil Company also increasing the price of agricultural goods, and we also see commercialized bonanza farms, which all only added to all of these economic and like hardships in actual farming in the frontier. One thing, it led to the progressive era reforms like the Grange movements and farmer alliances, which would later become populist movements. Yay. But by 1890, the American frontier closes despite all this unionization, and we see a shift towards urbanization and industrialization. Now we're going to get into labor in the Gilded Age, which was not fun. As industrialization boomed in the Gilded Age, the gap between the rich and the poor expanded significantly. You had a lot of economic inequality. The industrialization led to the growth of large factories, the rise of big business, which concentrated wealth and power into the hands of a small group of industrialists and business leaders, leading to this increase of economic inequality. Workers in this time often worked long hours in unsafe, unhealthy conditions for low pay. Many of these workers were immigrants or members of minority groups who face discrimination and often paid less than other workers. We also saw children who were commonly employed in these harsh conditions, which all of this led to the rise of labor unions and the labor movement, as they all wanted to like improve their workers' wages and their rights and their working conditions. And the management often used like various tactics to suppress these movements and maintain the status quo. Like they used lockouts where they closed factories, they blacklist names of pro-union workers, and they had yellow dog contracts, which workers were told as a condition for employment they cannot agree or sign up to be in a union. One of like the greatest examples of like anti-union techniques is in the Great Railroad Strike. Which was a strike by railroad workers that was put down by state militias and federal troops, these strikers being arrested and killed. And we also see in the Pullman strike, where the Pullman Palace Car Company used lockouts against their workers to break the strike, which ultimately led to the nationwide railroad strike. And we also see the Haymarket riot in Chicago, a significant event in history in the history of labor unions. It was during a labor protest in support of workers striking for an 8-hour workday, and it turned violent when someone threw a bomb at the police. This incident had a major impact on the Knights of Labor, who were one of the most influential labor unions of the time. And the Knights of Labor had already been struggling with declining membership and internal conflicts, which ultimately was further weakened by the negative public perception of labor unions following this riot. So the Haymarket riot had an impact on the labor movement because it increased government repression of labor unions and further weakened the power of organized labor during the Gilded Age. Okay, now we can move on to comparison like period 7. So we have immigration and immigration and migration, where we see the differences between old immigrants, people who had come to the United States before the 1890s. Then they were mostly from Northern and Western Europe. And we see new immigrants who came to the United States after the 1890s from Southern and Eastern Europe. And these immigrants were poor and uneducated and often faced discrimination and prejudice. We also saw Chinese immigrants work in mines and railroads, where they also face the same poor conditions, discrimination, and prejudice. And this is where we start to see the African American migration into urban areas to work as unskilled laborers. All these people would later form ethnic enclaves, and most of these immigrants would go into settlement houses that were later exposed to be very dirty, they were unsanitary, unlivable conditions. And I want to add an addendum on the Chinese immigrants. Only the ones who were, designated, the ones who were allowed in, because after the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which started to restrict Chinese immigration, only those ones were allowed to work in the mines and the railroads. And we also see the continuation of nativist sentiment when we see the Immigration Restriction League, which is exactly how it sounds, a group of people who were advocating for immigration restrictions. And we also see the rise of Americanization, where we assimilate immigrants to American society and promote national unity. So all of this is like really leading up to the question of like, what caused migration to rural and urban areas? Okay. So number one was not only because industrialization and urbanization made it possible for some of these people to gain some level of social mobility, like we see with African Americans, they could try to release themselves from sharecropping and the Black codes and the KKK in the South and move up to work in factories and gain money for their families. We also see people trying to escape. We still see the same reasons, trying to escape religious persecution, us and starvation in this time. Okay. Hold on, my screen is black. Wait a minute. I'll refresh. It'll be fine. I'll refresh. No worries.
So a lot of you guys were asking in the chat while Nyla refreshes about muckrakers, and here they are. These are good ones to know about. Muckrakers, in general, are like investigative reporters. They uncovered the problems with society. And as we just saw from period 6, there were a lot of issues from industrialization, immigration, urbanization, overcrowding, terrible working conditions. I was just telling them who muckrakers were.
Okay. All right, so we got through all those. Okay, so the effects of the muckrakers was like really, this was the progressive era, the age of reform, right? So we see some of the effects like with Upton Sinclair and the Jungle, which led to the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1907 and the creation of the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. And we also see the Whole House began like the social worker profession, and generally, if you want to think about it, this age reform led to greater government intervention, the regulation of big business, reforms to the political system, and improvements to the working conditions and welfare of citizens. But we also see some like racial, as we explained, I believe on night 3, that there were racial divisions among progressives. That although there are these people that were championing reform, they also often held like race. They also could hold racist, anti-Semitic, and anti-immigration views. Like some supported or ignored the segregation of African Americans and favored literacy tests and immigration restrictions. Even the people that were working the Whole House is the ones that were social workers did this. And we see all this culminate in like we all see some racial divisions between like African American leaders. We have Booker T. Washington, who was all about like we have to be we need to go into work and be economically equal to white people in order to get our freedom. And W.E.B. Du Bois was having none of that. And he was saying we're gonna get our freedom anyway, no matter what we do. So Du Bois founds the NAACP, which functions still to this day. Okay, I was just seeing if there are any other questions. I think I'm going a little too fast. Am I good? Ooh. Okay, so now we're going to go on to the Great Depression and the effects of after the Great Depression, we see the significant expansion of the role in the government and the American economy. Think with FDR and all of his like programs. Like I want to say specifically the ones I remember the most: the Social Security Act and FDIC. The government took on a larger role and responsibility in providing for social welfare and employment. And they also were responsible for modern American liberalism. I'll explain it. Don't worry, I already hear it. I'll explain it. Go in my notes. Okay. So the programs of the Great Depression that improved the economy through increased government intervention redefined the goals and the ideas of modern American liberalism. It emphasized the role of government in promoting social and economic justice and established the idea that the government has the responsibility to ensure the welfare of its citizens. Also, we see that innovations in communications and technology, like the telephone, the telegraph, and the radio, contributed to a growth of mass culture in America in the earliest 20th century. The technologies allow for like rapid dissemination of information and entertainment, and help to create a more connected and unified national culture. There were also increased debates over the effects of popular culture on like the morals and the values and American national identity. And some people argue that the rise of popular culture had a negative effect on society because it promoted materialism and encouraged the decline in traditional values and morals. We see this in the Scopes trial, which was held in Tennessee and centered around the question of whether or not the state could ban the teaching of evolution in public schools. On one side, we had the people who believed that the Bible was literal truth and evolution was dangerous, anti-religious doctrine. On the other side, we had people who believed that evolution was a scientifically established fact and it should be taught in schools as such. Also the economic factors like unemployment and poverty and desire for better opportunities were drivers of internal migration as people move from rural areas to cities in search of work and a better life. And global events like at this time World War I and the Russian Revolution led to large-scale international migration. People fled conflict, persecution, and political instability in their home countries. We can move on to another slide, but I want to answer the Scopes trial. The Scopes trial was basically that it was held that it was argued that the government that schools cannot teach evolution in the government. It only strengthened the divide between a tradition like urban northern like cosmopolitan like free thinking people and like southern religious fundamentalists. Okay, now we're going on to military power, where the participation in the series of global conflicts propelled the United States into a position of international power, renewing domestic debates over the nation's proper role in the world. In 1898, in the Spanish-American War, the U.S. gained control of Hawaiian Islands, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. The country expanded their territory and influence, and public debates intensified on America's role in the world. We see anti and pro-imperialist debates, and they reflected the larger questions of anxieties of like American society at the time, because the country was still trying to define its place in like a rapidly changing world. Some believe that we had a responsibility to promote our values and interests over the world. Others believe that we should just focus on our own internal affairs and leave well enough alone. But after World War I, these debates only intensified about the nation's role in the world, like how to best achieve national security and pursue American interests. The U.S. emerged from World War I as the world's leading economic power. Thriving industrial base, abundant natural resources, our military played a key role in the Allied victory in World War I, and our military prowess helped establish our reputation as a major military power. We also took an active role in shaping post-war nationalism. Post-war settlement and international organizations like the League of Nations that were created to maintain peace and stability in the aftermath of the war. But after World War I, we retreated back to isolationism. After World War II, our place on the world stage was cemented. Our war effort led to increased industrial production and job opportunities that led to end the Great Depression and led to an economic boom. The war created a shortage of labor, leading to the integration of women and minorities into the workforce, and there were significant advancements in technology at the time. like the development of radar, jet engines, and yes, the atomic bomb. We'd have played a decisive role in defeating the Germans and the Japanese. And because after the war, like Europe and Asia were basically demolished, we kind of helped rebuild them. We helped rebuild major countries in Europe through the Marshall Plan, which provided economic assistance to European countries to rebuild their economies after the war. We also emerged as a superpower after the war, playing like a role in the formation of international organizations like the United Nations and NATO. We also actively in this time sought to contain Soviet influence around the world, as it was also growing to be a superpower at the time. So like really to recap, it's like a really good like period 7 is like really good to review, like the trace themes and causations related to 3 topics. I'd say like 1, the growth of the US economy, its ups and its downs. 2, the changes in technology and mass culture during this time. And 3, the emergence of the United States as a world global power through warfare. Ooh, okay. We're doing pretty good on time, too. And now we move into period 8, right? Where we talk about the Cold War. Yippee. Okay. So, after World War II, the country experienced greater economic prosperity and... Oh, hold on. You got to change the slide. Okay. After World War II, the country experienced a period of economic prosperity and demographic changes. During this time, the civil rights movement gained momentum, leading to like increased social and political equality for African Americans, other minorities. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union had a significant impact on society during this time period. Usually when people talk about this section, you'll be asked to explain the context for the societal change from 1945 and 1980. And when they talk about this, you have to mention the Cold War. You got to mention the Cold War, like at some point. It's like the easiest one. It's the easiest one. So during the Cold War, the United States engaged in a struggle with the Soviet Union to limit the spread of communism and promote democracy and capitalism. And this led to a focus on national security and development of the military-industrial complex and efforts to contain Soviet influence through foreign policy and military alliances like NATO. Okay. Cold War policies, like the ones related to national security and the containment of communism, led to public debates over the right balance between government power and individual rights. So we had discussions about the limits of executive power, the use of surveillance and other measures to protect national security, the rights of individuals being suspected of being involved in subversive activities. The Cold War led to a climate. We had political repression and paranoia, and we had accusations of communist infiltration in the government and the media and institutions, which led to the rise of, I think this is the second Red Scare, and the beginning of the House Un-American Activities Committee, which is like the most, I want to say, Margaret Atwood phrase I've heard in my life, but I digress. It investigated people suspected of having ties with the Communist Party, and civil liberties like freedom of speech, press, and assembly were affected by this political atmosphere. The U.S. Wanted to promote a free market global economy through the Marshall Plan, and the creation of the international institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and it played a major role in the creation of international security systems like the UN. Okay. So So now we have the civil rights movement and various movements for change. I want you to note like three people that will most likely show up on the test. I mean, on my test, I got a question about Huey P. Newton. I don't know about y'all, but and I was scared. But anyway, I digress. And so we have like significant achievements in civil rights in this period, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965's laws that prohibited discrimination on the basis of race in voting, education, and the workplace, and helped to end legal segregation. We also see We also see like in this period the beginning of affirmative action, which is currently under threat like every other year. So affirmative action was a set of public policies that promote equal employment and educational opportunities for traditionally unrepresented groups like women and minorities. The purpose was to counter the effects of discrimination by creating opportunities for those who were denied them in the past. Huey P. Newton was a significant figure in the Black Panther Party. Oh, Radical Black Power movement, which emphasized racial pride, self-determination, challenged white supremacy and systemic racism. And we also see activities in women's rights, women's rights movement achievements that starts with the feminist Mystique and Betty Friedan, and some key achievements were the Equal Pay Act of 1963, which made sure that that there is no wage gap in the workforce. And we also see the beginnings of Title IX, which was a federal law that prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in any federal funded education program or activity. It applies to all aspects of education, from admissions to housing to recruitment, athletics, counseling, and employment. And we also see the gay liberation movement with the Stonewall riots, which were a series of spontaneous and violent demonstrations by the LGBT community in response to a police raid that took place in Stonewall Inn in New York's Greenwich Village in 1969. They are considered to be the single most important event leading to the modern LGBT rights movement in the United States. We see Executive Order 10450. I say 10450, but I've heard it pronounced different ways. But we all see Executive 10450, which was issued by Eisenhower in 1953, that prohibited any person employed by the U.S. government or any organization, or a member of any organization that advocated for the overthrow of the U.S. government by force or violence. One of the earliest and most restrictive orders of its kind. We see Oberfeld G. Hodges, which protects the rights of same-sex couples to marry. And we see we also see the American Indian movement, where one of their major achievements was the Self-Determination Act of 1975. Right, Self-Determination Act of 1975 that allowed all the sovereign nations to declare their independence and their sovereignty, a step into recognizing the right to all self-determination and autonomy. It was met with support and remains like an important document in the modern international system. And then on period 9, we go through never mind. So in period 8, we go through like the post-war demographic changes. So we see the beginnings of the creation of a new middle class due to the strong economic boom, high GDP growth, and widespread prosperity. We see the ideas of the new American dream and the suburban lifestyle, which all of this conformity was often criticized and led to the 1960s counterculture, which rejected the traditional forms and values of American establishment. They were anti-establishment and anti-war, and more anti-war sentiment continued on into the 60s and 70s, where liberalism popped up, where the idea was they wanted individual rights and freedoms and a limited role of government. That was criticized for not being like radical enough, that people wanted wealth redistribution and more government welfare programs. And all of this led to the counter backlash to the backlash was the new conservative movement led by Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan. And I'm hearing the boos in the crowd. Who advocated for less of a government and a return to traditional values. Yeah. I think we skipped a slide. Yeah, we skipped like the period 9 slide.
I don't know if it's here then. Hold on. I see the Cold War, movements for change, post-war demographic, and then it goes straight to the Q&A.
Oh, really? Okay. That just might be me then. All right. Okay, so now we're just opening, I guess now we're opening up to the Q&A. Period 9, you guys, never shows up. It really doesn't show up because all you really need to know is that we see influx of immigration. Fertility rate falls to its lowest level because I guess when you're poor, you don't want to have children. Who knew? We also see changes in life expectancy because we see improvements in healthcare and technology, and changes in geographic mobility where people can, because of our interconnected system of roads and trains, people can move from state to state and region to region with little to no problems. And we see changes in family structure, like the increase of single parent households and decline of married couples with children. Okay. This is a perfect time for anybody who's here like to take a small break, but I'm here to answer questions. Détente. Okay. The détente was an easing of tensions. It was a relaxation of hostility between two nations. It is between the two nations, the Soviet Union and the United States. It's referred to the period of improved relations between the Soviet Union and the U.S. during the 1970s. Both sides reduced their military presence in Europe and signed a number of key arms and control agreements.
I see a question here. Tips to historiography, short answer questions, which we haven't talked about yet. So that's a great one. You will have a short answer question that asks you to compare two different historians' viewpoints on the same topic. So the style of the question is always the same. The first question will say, what is briefly just explain the difference of interpretation. So you should spend one sentence summarizing the first historian and one sentence summarizing the second one. So while David Blight says this, Eric Foner says that. And it can really just be that simple. You don't need to get into the intricacies of the differences. Just state what each historian is arguing. So you do need to read through their passage, interpret it, really get at the main idea. Then B will ask you to support the first historian with historical evidence. And then C, you'll support the second historian with historical evidence that's not found in the passage. So you can use lots of different examples. For all of them, there's 10 to 12 different pieces of evidence that will fit. Just make sure you explain why. So you can't just say like literacy tests helps to prove David Blight's point. You have to explain why literacy tests prove his argument. Going back to the chat to see if there's any questions.
Someone asked the difference between the first and second Red Scare and the first and second Great Awakening. I can answer the Red Scare one.
Mhm.
I don't think there are very many differences because they were both a period of heightened fear of radicalism and anti-communism in the United States. The first one takes place immediately after World War I, and the second one takes place in the 1940s and 1950s. So like almost after World War II. They were both a period of anti-communist hysteria, and they both led to like mass investigations and hearings and passage of like anti-communist laws and arrests and stuff like that.
Yep. They're very similar. I would say the first Red Scare led to really like a crackdown on labor unions. They like raided their offices and, kind of accused them of being communist. And the second Red Scare was way more widespread. You have McCarthyism, you have the HUAC hearings. So the HUAC hearings is in the House. McCarthy hearings were in the Senate. The Hollywood 10, like attacking of Hollywood, writers, civil rights activists, and perceived spies. So the second Red Scare was way more extensive because we were in the midst of the Cold War at that point. And then the first and the second Great Awakening. The first Great Awakening takes place in the 1690s. So it's during colonial America, and it's really focused in New England on Massachusetts Bay Colony, the places where the colonists had come for religious freedom to practice their own religion. The Puritans, as they settled in, they became very successful. They were trading, they were getting rich off like mercantilism, and they lost some of that religious fervor. So the first Great Awakening was this like preachers who came and really like said, we need to go back to that super strict Calvinist theologies of predetermination. They called those sermons like fire and brimstone, because the preachers would just like basically yell at them, like, if you don't do this, if you don't live your life in these ways, you're gonna like burn in hell for eternity. It was like really intense. The second Great Awakening was almost entirely different. It was a religious revival. That's similar, but the belief was not on predetermination, which is that Calvinist belief that it's determined whether you're part of the elect or not. This says you could do good things on earth, and if you do, you'll kind of earn your way towards salvation. And so this led to those reform movements because people said, well, we can help people here on earth. We can make things better. And if we do that, that's going to help us out later on. So Second Great Awakening led to abolitionist movement, women's rights movement, temperance movement, these utopian communities. There was kind of a increase of different religious denominations. Mormonism comes out. Some evangelical groups emerged during this time. And the main areas were Western New York and like down into Kentucky and kind of that part of the Western frontier.
Maybe we should like go to like the last slide of the DBQ. Like, how would you write it? Because on the slides, everyone, we have like the entire DBQ and all the sources. We might not have enough time to break them down.
Okay. Someone has a question about prompts. We can do that as we're going to that, but it's how do you answer an FRQ that asks you to evaluate the extent, and a DBQ might also ask you to evaluate the extent. I think it's really helpful to know that an evaluating the extent prompt is a debatable question, and different people can have different answers. So really imagine yourself on like a spectrum, or imagine the prompt on a spectrum. It's evaluating the extent. So you might be all the way over here, right? If it's a continuity and change, like everything changed around this turning point, or you're over here, like nothing changed. Everything stayed the same around this turning point. Figure out where you are on that spectrum. That's the extent. And then you're going to evaluate like why you're placing yourself there. Some things changed, but ultimately there was this continuity. And you can argue something in the middle. You can do like a modifying of the argument, and that probably would give you like the most interesting response. Same thing with the DBQs. What's the slide you want to go to, Janila?
Maybe we should all like we all have the resources in the slide. I just want to open this up to like general questions, pep talks, because like you guys, I'm being so serious. I just took my AP Lit exam, right? I was running on like maybe 3 hours of sleep. My fault. Don't be like me. But it's not as bad as it ever. Tests aren't as bad as you think it was. I took my first the AP US test and the AAP World test. I thought it was gonna be like actual fire and brimstone. I thought I was gonna be sweating, convulsing, like absolutely seizing on the floor. But it was just fine. Like those 3 hours, what was like 3.5 hours? They went by fast. Like when you're in the moment, you don't think about how stressed you are. You just think about how much you're gonna ace it. Because that's all you can do. That's all you can do, really. Y'all got it.
I'm just jumping on for like the last several minutes just to echo what y'all said. Like, I'm just so proud of everyone. Like, y'all have spent 15 hours together in these group chats, reviewing all this tons of APUSH content. Like, you're gonna be all right. Like, I'm just been watching the chat and like y'all know so much. You really are gonna be okay. And at the end of the day, like, just a test. Just a test. It's just College Board gets one shot at telling you, how they feel about you, but it's just a test.
Yeah, and like for some of the tests I take, I feel like College Board, like they want to give you the point. They want to do it so bad. All you got to do is make it easy for them. That's all you got to do. Because sometimes I write like the most outrageous theses. And you know what? I passed. Like, I mean, come on, you guys. It is never as bad as you might think it is. You're gonna get the 5. You're gonna get the credit. Like, lay off a little bit, and please, like, go to sleep. Don't be me. Don't be me.
My best last minute advice is like, don't leave anything blank.
Yeah.
Write something. Answer the multiple choice with something. Answer every essay, every question with something, like dig deep if you have to, but if you leave it blank, you get it wrong for sure. If you put something on there, who knows? You might get it. Any other last minute advice? Anyone else? Any other host?
I don't want to see any of y'all on https:/collegeboard.com/practice test. Don't do it. Don't you do it. Go, please relax.
Yeah,
studying the night before is not going to help you. It's just going to make you like every time I studied for the test a night before, I never passed.
Yeah, like you've done a lot tonight, so you should pat yourself on the back, relax, do something for yourself, get a good night's sleep, and have a good breakfast tomorrow with high protein. That's going to keep up your stamina. Avoid like sugary processed foods so that you don't crash during it, and bring some water.
Yes.
Stay hydrated.
Is it a bad idea to watch TV the night before? Definitely not. It's a great idea. Go find the dumbest show you can and just melt. Like, yeah, you need it. And no matter what happens, like, you get a 1, I promise you, Amanda from Fileable is still proud of you because you did all this work. Like, this is way more important than the score, the test, any of it. So you just remember that while you're taking your test. No matter what I do on this test, I will still be proud of you. We'll even send you an email afterwards letting you know. Really quick, there's a Night 5 survey. This is the very last one. If you could please fill this survey out for us so that we can see what your confidence levels look like at this point. Looks like 14 of you have already filled it out. Thank you to those 14, but maybe we can get this up to, 100, 150 or so, to just really get a full sense of how it went, how any feedback you have. And we're going to send you another one tomorrow for just like other cram feedback. So as we continue to build out crams, we can keep making them even better for you. All right, we've made it. We've done it. Any hosts have anything left to say? Anything left unsaid?
I mean, I'm glad we spent these last 5 nights together. I'm really happy you decided to spend it here. I hope you all do well. Matter of fact, I don't just hope. I know it. I feel it in my soul. I feel it rumbling.
Yes. Chat, can I get a huge round of applause and thank you for our hosts, all of whom have been absolutely crushing it here every night while they are also taking APs, teaching AP students, dealing with all the rest of the stuff in the world. And so thank you to them. Shout out to all of y'all.